The next session is presented by Amanda Selwood. It's titled Barriers to Administering, Retrieving, and Interpreting Online Cognitive Testing in Older Adult Cohort. Amanda is a research assistant with the Older Australian Twin Study. Before joining OATS, she worked in health services research at the Australian Institute of Health Innovation at Macquarie University and in memory research at the National Institute for Experimental Arts. Go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Jill. So can you see my screen okay? Yeah.
Yes.
So I'll be presenting on the barriers to administering, retrieving, and interpreting online cognitive testing in an older adult cohort who were participating in the Older Australian Twin Study, or OATS. OATS is a longitudinal study of healthy brain aging in Australian twins aged over 65. They were originally recruited from 2006 onwards across 3 states of Australia. Among other things, they received face-to-face cognitive assessments across 4 waves until 2017. Then in 2020 to 2021, we invited participants back to complete our first of hopefully many OATS online assessments. So we moved online for several reasons. Firstly, our staff are now only located in Sydney, New South Wales. So conducting local testing in Queensland and Victoria became almost impossible. We're hoping to expand to a nationwide cohort, and moving online will allow us to recruit a larger sample using fewer resources. It also increases the convenience and flexibility for our participants who are becoming more reluctant to travel to hospitals in the major cities for face-to-face testing that tended to take all day long. And the fact that our move coincided with the pandemic also didn't hurt. So we used 3 main cognitive assessments from 3 different external providers. CBS, or Cambridge Brain Sciences, has 10 activities across various domains, which takes around 50 minutes all up with a 10-minute break in the middle. The activities use various formats and they all used a mouse click response. So some of the tests scored performance using accuracy, some used a combination of accuracy and reaction time. And CogState has 4 activities across 4 different domains. It takes around 20 minutes all up. All of the activities involved recognizing playing cards and used a keyboard press response. So you press D for no and K for yes. 2 activities scored performance based on reaction time, and the other 2 scored performance based on accuracy. And then the MetraSquare Emotion Recognition Task, or ERT, includes 96 trials. It takes around 10 to 15 minutes to complete. It involves videos of faces morphing into emotions of various strengths, and participants just have to click on the correct emotion using their mouse. I should probably note that if they're using an iPad, they just tap the screen for all of these tests. So there are 3 types of barriers that we came across in online cognitive testing in older adults. The first is barriers to administering online testing. So because we were using tests from external providers, we had to integrate their platforms with our own web apps, which was different for each provider. So for example, CogState requires us to have our own API. They all each had their own minimum technical specifications, such as screen resolutions, an up-to-date internet browser, things like that. But in terms of barriers unique to our study population of older adult participants, they're less likely than younger adults to have access to a computer with an up-to-date internet browser, reliable internet access, and things like that. Just to give you an idea of this, about 20% of our current participants don't even have an email address, let alone access to a computer. So they couldn't even participate in the online component of OATS. We just sent them a paper version of the surveys and had to forego the cognitive testing for those participants. Those that did have access didn't necessarily have computers that met the minimum technical specifications for all the tests. They also varied in their technological literacy and ability to troubleshoot. A small number reported physical restrictions such as arthritis, and some were less motivated and confident to persevere with online tasks, especially when they found them challenging or came across technical difficulties. However, I should note that many of our participants did actually prefer the online testing due to the convenience, and also they actually quite enjoyed the extra challenge involved. So it's not all bad news. So the second kind of barrier that I'll be talking about is barriers to retrieving online testing. So these are not unique to the older adult participants. So the method and frequency of data retrieval differed across our external providers. So some of them allowed us to automatically and continuously retrieve the data as participants completed the tasks. Others allowed automated retrieval, but it has to be scheduled at regular intervals, such as monthly, while others actually require us to make a request for manual data provision. Some external providers also place a cap on the number of data transfers per study, which makes it unsuitable for longitudinal data collection. And then after we've retrieved it, different providers gave us the data in different formats. So we need to develop functions to read and analyze the data to store it in a standard format that's meaningful to us. And then finally, when things go wrong, we are dependent on external providers' capacity to troubleshoot and provide personalized support. So the final type of barrier that I'll be talking about today is possibly the most challenging one, that is interpreting online testing in older adults. So one of the biggest challenges we came across is that many of our participants are aged over 80, which is an age group that's not well represented in the norms given to us by the test providers. So these three charts here show the sample sizes for each age group for each of the external providers' norms. So you can see that the sample sizes for the older age groups are much, much smaller than the younger age groups, sometimes with only a handful of participants or fewer, such as in the CBS sample of 95 to 100-year-olds, there were only 2. So for CBS especially, we found that our participants were not performing as well as would be expected based on the norms. And we don't know whether that's because our sample are actually impaired or whether the norms samples are not representative of their these age groups' performance. So the difficulty interpreting these scores is exacerbated by the fact that the oldest old tend to have poorer internet skills than the youngest old. So if our older participants perform poorly, we don't know if that's just due to normal aging, is that due to cognitive decline, or is it simply just their poorer internet skills? And were the older adult participants who were recruited into the norms testing, did they actually have better internet skills than their peers? We can't really know that for sure. Another issue is that the norms we received didn't take into account education and in some cases gender, which can affect performance on any neuropsych test, let alone online ones. So again, we just don't know how well our sample matches the samples used in the norms, and that hinders our ability to interpret whether a participant is performing normally or whether they are impaired. And then finally, we are unable to regulate testing environments. I think Ying will talk more about this, but testing environment is well known to affect performance, but at-home online cognitive testing, we just can't control it at all. So for example, reaction times can be sensitive to things like testing device and internet speed. And we can never really know for sure if they followed the instructions, whether they interrupted or distracted during the activities. We can only really rely on what they told us in their post-test feedback questionnaires, which is not really very comprehensive. So how do we overcome these barriers? Well, firstly, when it comes to administering and retrieving the data, we have JC, a dedicated health informatics specialist who dealt with all the barriers to administering and retrieving the data, especially when it came to liaising with the external providers and making sure our tests meet their criteria. Secondly, we gave participants a practice and a test version of the CBS and Cogstate activities. So these versions were exactly the same. They were just administered 1 week apart. And this was just to iron out any technical difficulties and make sure that they were able to access the tasks and that they were familiar with the format of each of the activities before they actually completed the test, seeing as we weren't there to help them through the test as they did it. We also provided participants with help during office hours via a telephone helpline, email, and an online ticketing system. The barriers to interpreting the data are more difficult to overcome. So for instance, with CBS, what we tried to do, this was the one that was hardest to interpret in our participants. We compared each participant's performance to the means and standard deviations of both the norm samples as well as our own sample. So if they were performing poorly against both samples, we can be a little more confident that they were actually genuinely performing poorly. And then we're also looking at creating our own norms by combining with other studies who are using the same tests on similarly aged samples, but they are difficult to find. So if anyone knows of anyone we can be in contact with, please let me know. And so I'd like to end with an example of how to do online testing in older adults well. CogScan is a study run by our colleagues at CIPHER that aims to compare 4 types of computer-administered neuropsych testing, including Cogstate and CBS. So they got participants to book a time for at-home online testing, and they had dedicated staff on call for help during that time. They gave participants iPads with detailed instructions ahead of time to eliminate access barriers, ensure device consistency, and reduce technical difficulties. Then afterwards, they gave participants questionnaires asking about the technical and external issues that occurred during the session that may have impacted task performance. This was also recorded by the staff supervisors if they received a call during the testing session. So this was to help determine whether poor performance was due to these issues or genuine cognitive impairments. Then they also interviewed participants about their experience of the online testing, and they found that half of them preferred at-home online testing, whereas the rest was split between no preference and preferring in-lab testing. However, this method does require a lot more staff hours and the ability to courier iPads to and from participants' homes, which can hinder the large-scale, nationwide testing that we're hoping to do. So it's not really applicable to us. Participants also reported difficulties with calling for help during the session because they were too busy trying to figure out how to do the online tests. So there is no one solution to overcoming these barriers. It is still a work in progress. So I should thank the rest of the OATS team, especially Vibeke and JC, who helped me put together this talk. Also, I'd like to thank Nikki and Ginny, my colleagues at CIPHER, for sharing the barriers that they encountered in testing older adults in their studies, CogScan and Rethink My Drink. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Any questions? Let's see, I see one here from Preeti Zanwar. You can go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Hi, Amanda. This was excellent presentation. I'm wondering the test you described, the CBS, Cogstate, EIT, or CogScan, if you had any data on how generalizable they are to adults or older adults in other parts of the world, especially in low and middle income countries. Just curious, how robust are these tests when it comes to context, given that they could vary based on education and gender as you describe?
Yeah, I think that is also one of the issues with them. They haven't been tested that well across the world. So given how limited the norm samples are for us, I would say that they haven't really been reliably tested in lower income countries or low education samples. So I think we do really need to do a lot of work in these online cognitive testing to get them to be at the same level of the pen and paper face-to-face neuropsych testing that we have been using up until now.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Ing, you want to ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Amanda. Well, I think in your conclusion slides, you noted that about half of the participants, they actually prefer the online testing, but the remaining ones are split. So I'm just wondering, is there any systematic difference, or do you think the subgroup who prefer the online, they're the same or they're different from the rest?
I don't actually know about that because that was provided by my colleague. She didn't really suggest any reason why they might have differed. It probably does depend on the experience that they had. If they did have technical difficulties, they probably would prefer the in the lab testing, and those who had poorer mobility probably preferred the at-home testing. But yeah, that's just speculation on my part.
Thank you.
Yeah, that would be interesting information if you had it. That's for sure.
Yeah.
All right.
I just want to add a comment. So I think you noted that for the COG USA, you guys use iPad, right?
Our participants use whichever device they already have at home, but the CogScan study provided them with iPads.
Okay, because in one of our studies, we actually look into the difference between people who use computer versus kind of the touch screens, and we do see an age difference and also some kind of SES difference between the two groups. So just
yeah, that's good to know. I don't think we actually recorded what device each participant used in our study, so that's something that would have been good to get. It might, yeah, it would be worthwhile exploring, I think, because I do think it does make a big difference to their responses, especially when it comes to reaction times and things like that.
Do you know if the companies who develop these tests or the people who develop these tests, I wasn't clear about where these came from or what they were exactly, because I'm not that familiar with
So
but
they're all commercial companies that have created these tests. I think the Cambridge Brain Sciences might be affiliated with the Cambridge University, but generally they are independent commercial companies that so they've created these tests and they're putting them out for researchers to use and clinicians as well in some cases. So we just have to rely on what they can give us and what other studies have found using these tests to determine if they are actually reliable or not.
yeah, it may be that as Ing was sort of saying, is that there may need to be separate or taking into account that device that's being used for sure.
Yes, I think that would be really good to know.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions or thoughts? Great. Thanks, Amanda. That was very interesting.
Thanks.
All right. So